Hi y'all, and welcome to the summer 2022 garden tour and what I like to call my love letter to the garden. So the garden tour this year is going to be a little different than prior years. I've decided this year to kind of take you around the garden, show you what's beautiful in the specific spaces and what's growing well there. And I thought what none better place to start than the vegetable garden, where it all began 4 years ago. So my name's Matthew. I garden in Southwest Ohio, Zone 6. We purchased this home in September 2017, and the garden really started to begin taking place in 2019. So a lot of the areas of the garden are brand new as of within the past just year. If you've been following along on my channel, you know that the garden doubled in the backyard. There's a lot of stuff that I'm going to show you that was not here last year and started being planted last August and September. But for right now, I want to focus on the vegetable garden. I'll pop a picture up on the screen of what this area looked like when we move in. It was nothing. It was just grass. And then immediately that fall that we moved in 2017, I put in some little tiny cedar raised beds just to grow some vegetables. I had been growing vegetables on my patio in apartments through school, and when I finally got a home, I knew that I wanted to have a vegetable garden. So I created this really tiny vegetable garden. Little did I know that was only going to last a season. In 2018, we did a lot of changes and put in the beds that are here now. Fast forward to 2019, and I started getting really focused on ornamental gardening, and everything that you see started in 2019 and really picked up progress in 2020. So most of my garden is only, a majority of it is only 2 years old. So this is an opportunity for you to see what a 2-year-old garden can look like. That being said, there's a lot of stuff in my garden that I planted from tiny shrubs that will just take some time to mature. And so this isn't one of those very old established gardens that you'll see that are really beautiful. That's something we're all striving for. For now, my garden is very young, but I want to show you just in a short period of time what you can do with that. So the vegetable garden here is kind of one of my favorite places this year. If you've been following along, you know I transitioned my dahlias up here, so I have various dahlias planted in this bed. I think there's probably around 15 to 20 just in this 9-foot, 10-foot bed space here that's about 2 foot wide, and they are done really, really good in this soil. So I've talked about leaving these in the ground. We're in zone 6, so dahlias don't typically winter over. But I will be leaving these in the ground because I don't like going back and storing those. And so I'm going to do a soil cable approach this winter when that rolls around and see if these can overwinter in the garden well in these raised beds. Besides that, we added micro clover this year to the pathways of the vegetable garden, which I was really kind of iffy about, but it's turned out really lovely. So micro clover doesn't get as tall necessarily as regular clover if you keep it groomed. I have not been cutting this micro clover, so it is a very, very thick, nice carpet. The intention was to suppress weeds, and it's doing a really good job. I'm still getting a little bit of weeds through there, but I think as the years progress and there's less weed seed that can germinate because of that micro clover, it will be even better. So other than that, we just have our greens, peppers, and other vegetables up here. It is about time to start planting other things in the vegetable garden, ripping out some of these greens and planting some fall greens. If you're local to this area, I found it really difficult to plant a lot of greens in spring necessarily because we heat up really quickly. We also tend to get cold pretty quickly, and so it's also difficult to sometimes grow those things in the fall because we go from warm to cool very fast, and some of those things do not survive in winter. So this garden tour also, I will be putting the names of plants to the extent I can and to the extent I remember. They will look like this. And if I miss anything, feel free to provide me a timestamp below in the video and I will give you the name of that. I'm going to do my best to mark the big stuff. Some of the smaller stuff on screen may not get marked, but if you're interested in knowing what that might be, feel free to ask and drop a comment below. Now that we've started where it all began, I want to take you to my favorite spot in the garden, but a spot that will be changing very quickly in the coming weeks. Let's go take a look. So if you've been following along, you know I love a pretty formal structure. However, that taste has transitioned over the past few years to something more cottage and something that I like to call structured cottage. It's kind of a term I came up with in a couple videos ago. And this part of the garden is one of my favorite. These are 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗲 hydrangeas by proven winners, flanked by emerald green 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲𝗲, and then there's a hedge of daylilies below here. And so before, earlier last year or late last year, I had Stand By Me clematis's tucked between the 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗲s here. I removed those because this is the north side of our house and it doesn't get enough light for those to really thrive really well. And so what I've done in this location is I am going to be pulling out these daylilies. These are Salome Double Classic and they have a beautiful pink color in spring. But because this is a northwest type facing area of our home, they don't bloom really great down here. You might be able to see that they're thinner right here and they thicken up a little bit and they bloom much better down there. So we're going to be taking these and putting them somewhere where they'll be happier, and I'm going to be replacing this area with some part shade plants. So tucked just behind these 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗲s are some other plants that I'm going to be putting in this space in the coming weeks, probably as early as this week. Some Hakanakloa, some Virginia, some coral bells and other items that can take a little sun, but primarily like that shade. And so this area is still going to be very formal in nature with the 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗲s and the emerald greens, but there will be a little cottagey border out front. So I don't have a very big space for that. There's just going to be kind of some areas in between these hydrangeas here to do that stuff, because these hydrangeas get quite large and this is their 4th growing season. And so these were planted in 2019. So this is really the year that they really just started doing well. And these blooms are already starting to dry and could be used in arrangements if I wanted to. So they're currently braced up a little bit. 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗲s do tend to have stronger stems than the typical Annabelle hydrangea, but they also will flop if we get a little bit of rain, especially when the blooms get this big and they've been wet. And so I have pruning videos on my YouTube if you're interested in how to prune your hydrangeas to allow them to have stronger stems and stay more upright and so they don't droop as much. But 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗲, even though it does have stronger stems, will always have fresh new growth on it that's a little floppier than last year's. And so let's transition to another part of the garden that's new as of the past year, so you can see what that area is looking like. So this has been one of my favorite new areas of the garden. We're at the back corner of the property. This fence was installed in last October, and this big bed began its process in August of last year with some simple cardboard and mulch on the ground for a no-dig method, and that method has done really well for me. And so probably one of my favorite things in the bed is this Rising Sun red bud. Below this Rising Sun we have some roses by proven winners called At Last that are really beautiful, flanked kind of surrounding in this ethereal look of Calamint. So behind there we have a Big Bang Spirea, some Coneflowers that are called Pink Puff, and as we transition to the back, this is where I focused a lot on color this year, or over the past year. And so you know my garden transition has kind of been to transition from all the blooms. I have over 100 hydrangeas in my garden, and so I've within the past year focused and switched kind of modes into interesting foliage. And so behind there we have an annual called Mahogany Splendor Hibiscus, and I really love this red color right here, and this may be something I repeat every year. It just looks really nice. Next to these golden ticket privet, these mini maroon barberries I believe is the name, and in the very back we have a black lace elderberry. And so this elderberry is going to be a lot of substance back here in the back corner one day. In my experience, these black lace elderberries tend to take a little bit of time to get going in my area. I know in some areas they grow really quickly, but I have planted one elsewhere in another garden and it's just now starting to grow on its 2nd to 3rd year. And so this one was transitioned back here last year, and so it's going to take a while to grow up in this space. But we also have some beautiful grasses, and this is kind of where I'm trying to focus on this cottagey look that's also pretty structured. So I want this area that's kind of well maintained, but also kind of ebbs and flows into each other. If you've been watching the channel, you know that some of these things are going to be moved to a different area of the garden just in the coming weeks, including these tough stuff 𝗂𝗂 hydrangeas, which were labeled to take full sun, but they definitely cannot take full sun in my area. Now this is their first year. They might acclimate okay, but I'm going to go ahead and move those and hopefully they'll be a little happier. You can see they're putting out new growth, but they did burn quite a bit when we had some really hard drought and heat earlier this year, just a matter of a month ago. And so this bed does not have a significant amount of drip irrigation. And one thing I've focused on in my garden is drip irrigation exclusively everywhere I have hydrangeas at least, but it's in all the new beds that I created a couple years ago and the older beds that were here when we purchased the home. Now I did not install drip irrigation in these new parts of the garden that I put in last year, except along the property line. So the golden ticket privets, this rising sun has drip. This hydrangea below the rising sun, which is Firelight Tidbit, I believe, also has drip, but it kind of stops there at the edge. My thought process was I just want to transition into planting plants that don't necessarily require drip irrigation and that can survive on their own. I do have a sprinkler system for my lawn, and so this gets a little bit of overspray, and we've been lucky enough to get enough moisture this year that it's not been a big issue, and I've not had to hand water a whole lot. So I'm loving that approach, less water waste. This property is also slanted downhill quite a bit, and so to the extent there's runoff from the house, it usually transitions, you know, down towards the garden, stops at the front, and then slowly works its way back across all of these plants, which has been really nice. Let's go take a look at some other parts of the garden. Now this area is also an area that gets quite a number of looks. It is flanked by these Bobo Hydrangeas, which stay kind of shorter. You know, Bobo will get fairly large. They bloom on new wood. They're gorgeous. Below those, we have some Red Rover Heuchera. And so that's all that's right here. And then it's capped on each corner of this patio that we put in 2 years ago by Limelight Hydrangea standards. These are beautiful. You can prune them, you know, by a third each year, and they will always produce these beautiful buds for you. They dry really well in arrangements. We did get some rain overnight, which is making the garden look beautiful, but they will droop a little bit if you get heavy rainfall, as these are right here. You can see the rain on them right there. But there's also some cat's pajamas catmint under here, some echinaceas that are kind of tucked in. These Bobos are in their third year as well. These were planted in 2020, and so these are getting pretty big, and they're putting on a lot of growth in this area. At the end, we have more of these emerald green arborvitae here, which are a really nice winter structure for this space, and some David Alston roses called Olivia Alston, which produces this beautiful scented pink roughly bloom that I'm really in love with. So this area around the patio is a perfect mirror of each other. This side of the stairway right here is exactly the same as the other side. So we just have a green gem boxwood or a winter gem boxwood here that could use a little pruning. I don't typically focus a whole lot on keeping my boxwood super pruned and maintained. I do that maybe once a year, maybe twice if I feel it's needed, because I don't have a problem with a fluffy boxwood, as I like to call it. There's more Bobo Hydrangea here. They're emerald green. We have a pink lemonade baptisia that is going to get moved later this fall. And then we have a Sunjoy barberry, which is a sterile variety by proven winners. It's yellow and it's very pyramidal shape. I'll put the name on screen so you can know what that is if you're interested in it. And pretty much we've carried around the Red Rover Heuchera. This is Stormcloud Amsonia, which is also getting moved. I've kind of trimmed it back a little bit because it's been kind of aggressive in its growth rate, and it's taking over other plants, so that's something we're going to be moving later this fall. And behind here is a rose by David Alston called Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin has not done the best for me, and I would say its blooms are not exactly what I ordered. I thought it was more of a yellow rose based on the pictures online, but it's tend to be a little more pink, and so that's perfectly fine, but doesn't also seem to bloom very well in this location. So that might be something that I'm looking at replacing in the coming years. On the other side of the garden, on the stairway, is one called the Poet's Wife, and I'll take you over there and show you that right now. So the only thing really different about this space right here is this rose called the Poet's Wife. It is one of the best smelling roses I have in my garden and one of my absolute favorites. I am a sucker for a yellow or orange rose, and if you don't have the Poet's Wife in your garden, it is very vigorous, so I do have to keep it pruned back a little bit, but it's also very floriferous, and so it produces a ton of blooms. It just kind of is lulling after its second flush for the summer, and so there's a ton of cutback that I need to do here, some deadheading, but it's still got buds on it that are coming out even this late in summer, and I'm just really impressed with its growth rate and both the smell of its blooms and the number of its blooms that it puts on. This area of the garden is new as of last year. This is an area that was started in the spring of 2021, and it's transitioned quite a lot since I started this space. So we went and picked out this beautiful fountain in the spring of 2021 after I kind of created this bed space, and I feel like it is the perfect element for this area. It looks really beautiful. It's kind of squatty, but also gives enough substance and noise for the backyard, around the entire backyard, that I really love it. I was concerned when I purchased it that it wouldn't provide enough sound, and it really does. And this was called the Grand Regal Tier, I believe, by Henry Studios. We picked it up locally. It's really beautiful. And so we planted a lot of perennials around here last year. I actually added a kaleidoscope abelia here in a video earlier in the spring. These geraniums are Boom Chakalaka by Proven Winners, and they are beautiful. They're actually starting to reflush. I never cut these back this year because the seed heads look really interesting, and they're still doing some rebloom there. So I needed some structure in this space. I realized this coming spring after having this garden here a bit. We had the pergola installed in March of this year, and so there just needed to be some more interest here that is upright but natural. And so I went to the garden center and picked out this Fuchsia Dogwood, which is a beautiful dogwood that produces very large white blooms in spring. It is followed by fruit, which can, I think, turn a little pink. It's not quite yet, but there are little pieces of fruit on here that's been pollinated that look really nice. And I think it is the perfect tree for this spot. It'll provide a little shade to the home, and it'll be a perfect structure both for privacy at the pergola and also just in the garden as a beautiful natural element in this space. Behind the dogwood, there's another dogwood shrub, and it is called Pucker Up by Proven Winners. And it is one of my favorite shrubs in the garden. It doesn't produce, you know, super beautiful elaborate flowers or anything, but the foliage is what is so spectacular about this shrub. Puckered Up is the perfect name because it's just very, very puckered essentially. And right behind it here I have a cherry bush actually, or a small cherry tree bush. This cherry tree I believe is called Zuzu cherry. It's really beautiful. It stays relatively small, but it will have those beautiful blooms in spring for me, and also maybe some scent for the patio area. Along the corner here is a rose called Lady of Shallot, also called Lady of Shallot, depending if you're using UK English or American English. It is a really beautiful orange rose, one of my favorites in the garden. It smells really lovely. It has been a little wild. I will have to admit it's gotten quite large and I've had to keep it maintained throughout the year, but it's produced and grown really quickly, and it just keeps putting on new growth and buds throughout the season. So that's also a winner for your garden if you're looking for another rose to add. Down here in front of the fountain, we have some bushes called Yuki cherry blossom. And these I'm going to be moving this fall. They don't typically tend to love the water from the fountain very much. So they're looking a little rough right now. They've been there 2 years. They're a member of the hydrangea family, but they only bloom in spring. And so they have these beautiful pink and white blooms in spring, but after that, they're kind of done for the year, and they're just kind of a foliage texture. They have tended to spread a little bit when I've thrown some mulch on them, and so they've rooted. So I may have enough that I can move around the garden in separate areas and watch them do really well. We also have some gems down here, which are called, I believe those are Tempo Orange, and so those are down here at the bottom. And they're kind of flanked by some more of that red rover heucherella, as well as some back to the Fuchsia Salvia, which is really beautiful in spring. I'll put a picture on the screen of what that looks like. It was cut back a few weeks ago. It does not tend to be the best rebloomer, but it's really beautiful in spring, and that's one of the reasons I have it there. It's not so bad a bad foliage texture right now, but I really love it, and it's spring prime. So this area of the garden is the newest bed in the garden. This is my south side perennial bed. It's supposed to be more cottagey looking than probably any other parts of my garden. And so in this space, there's mostly perennials, a couple shrubs, including this blue arrow juniper for some nice blue foliage texture that's evergreen against the green giant arborvitae behind here. We have a few boxwoods tucked in there. I may add a few more to this area for some more winter structure that's just kind of fades away during the summer, but is some nice substance later in the winter. Because if you're familiar with me, you know I went through this phase last year where I was just like tired of perennials. I try and focus on a lot of tiny, beautiful shrubs that provide a lot of foliage or blooms or textures in the garden instead of perennials. I've kind of transitioned a little bit of that this past year into more perennials after I found some varieties that I was really in love with. And so we have cat's pajamas, cat mint below me. We have an Amelia called Bloodstone, which is really beautiful pink blooms down here. We have a Scabiosa that's not completely in bloom, but I'll put the name on the screen. I can't remember it. There's a new grass by Proven Winners right here called Lemon Lime, and I'm really loving these seed heads. They're really nice texture, and this will be a nice limey foliage against this blue arrow juniper here specifically. We do have some sunflowers by Sunflower Steve. These were planted earlier this spring, and I'm finally getting some blooms on them. I didn't plant a ton, and I had intended to do kind of a repetition sowing, and I never got around to that. But there's still probably time if I put some seeds in the ground right now that I could get blooms before our first frost. So I may work on that. We kind of have a repetition of the mini maroon barberry kind of under this lemon squeeze, which will provide some nice red foliage next to this lime grass and the blue arrow juniper. So you can see I'm playing with a lot of colors in this area of the garden. There's a salvia here, which I hoped to become my favorite. I'm not a big salvia person, but this is perfect profusion. It is the perfect like baby blue flower, and it's supposed to be the best reblooming salvia Proven Winners makes, and this is their first year, as I mentioned, and it's already reblooming. So I cut it back a few weeks ago, and it's already got blooms on it right here. So I'm definitely loving that so far, and it's doing really well holding up to its name. This is a peony called Canary Brilliance. It has beautiful yellow blooms in the spring that kind of have some orange to them as well. We have a Baptisia behind there, which is really beautiful. I'll put the name on the screen. And then we just have a mix of like coneflowers, this Bloodstone Amelia. These coneflowers, one of them's called White Perfection, and it has the most beautiful white bloom you have ever seen in a coneflower. It was the perfect name given to the specimen. It's just looked really, really well in the garden this year. And right behind there, we have the perfect blooming thing in the garden right now, this cherry Choco Latte Hibiscus by Proven Winners. It's really gorgeous. I love the blooms. It is in full bloom right now. It still has a ton of buds on it. So if you're familiar with hibiscus, you know the blooms only last a day. So it's a really spectacular sight that it produces this many blooms in a single day and repeats that for weeks on end. I really love this variety because it has a dark textured foliage, which is typically hibiscus have like a really kind of can be a limey green color, at least the older varieties. This dark foliage texture is really nice. Now, it only does this show for a few weeks in the end of July and the beginning of August, so it is kind of a short, bloomer for you, but it does really well in its spot. This was moved this past year from under the willow to over here, and it's just done really good with that transition. Below here, I have a plant that I get comments on quite often, and it's called Peter Cottontail Yarrow. Now, it doesn't look like a yarrow. It looks very much like a baby's breath, and I think you could use it that way in arrangements. I've not had an opportunity to do that yet. I did not cut it back, but it has continuously been in bloom for months now and has done really, really well. We have this sweet Henry Itea that's kind of hidden behind this yarrow right now. These are Serendipity Alliums that kind of make a drift around these coneflowers. This is just a simple zinnia that I planted to fill some space. These coneflowers are called one in a melon, a nice play on words of 1 in a million. They are massive and they are this beautiful yellow color. You can see some of the newer blooms are yellow. They fade to a very pale yellow. You can see this one's a little paler, and they just get paler until they turn almost white. So it's a really beautiful mix here. And right behind these coneflowers, we have this beautiful bed with strawberries and blueberries, dwarf blueberries that produce some blueberry fruit for me. The strawberries are actually reblooming right now. And in this garden bed, I have planted a love and a puff vine, which has been one of my favorite things I've planted this year, annual from seed. It looks really ethereal and magical along this fence, and I can't believe this is one plant. And so I'll probably be repeating that in this area year after year. It just looks really great. Now it's kind of taken over, and I'm concerned about it reseeding, but people have told me it's kind of easy to pull. And so hopefully we won't have a big issue with that, but if we can, I think it's worth it because it's kind of magical. This area of the garden is also really new, and it's become one of my favorite as well. I keep saying that, but the garden is just looking really great right now. So this Calamint is probably one of my most favorite new plants. It is constantly covered in pollinators. It is really cottagey looking. It underflanks this kind of boxwood topiary I have here. And then we have some Italian ice roses, which I've mentioned are a beautiful rose. They come out kind of yellow, fade to this pink little ombre looking rose. This is a landscape rose, so similar to like the drift type roses, so they'll stay pretty small. It's not a shrub rose, even though it has put off quite a bit of upward growth. It just needs to be trimmed down and maintained a little bit. We have some more of the repetition of the white perfection coneflowers, some Gara, and some more of the Serendipity Alliums around here, and this brass buckle ilex, which is really beautiful this time of year. This is an evergreen, and it just stays really small, and it has this beautiful yellow color when exposed to sun, and so I'm kind of got a drift of them going on here. Behind there, we have a wedding cake Spirea, which did bloom a little bit this year. A lot of this area was planted with shrubs that are really tiny, and so it's going to take several years to develop this space. Just a green mountain boxwood to the side. This is the wedding cake Spirea. This is an Illuminati mock orange called Arch, so it's supposed to have a more arching habit. These are opalescence phlox, and let me move the camera so I can talk more about this other space. So this area is really beautiful as well, I think. We're going to have a perfect ring of boxwood here. I think I will do these boxwoods when they eventually grow up into like a sphere shape hedge all the way around, which will be kind of really manicured and really beautiful. In between there, we have wee white hydrangeas. So this is going to be just a flush of bloom one day. These were all planted really small. And so these will be, my goal is for a constant, you can't see the ground. It's only white blooms in between this round hedge of boxwood here. Underneath that, or to the side here, are Weigela called Purple Effect 𝗟𝗂𝗋𝗄, and they're actually blooming right now, which is really odd for this time of year for them to be blooming, but they were planted small, so they put on a lot of new growth, and they're looking really great. I really love this texture. Some are planted too close to the edge because they were planted before I decided to come in and put this monkey grass in the front, which I think is called Big Blue. And so I'm going to be digging some of these up in spring and kind of tucking them in the center of these other ones. So we'll just have a mass of variegated foliage here that looks really nice. We have some sedums here, which I'll put the name on the screen. And then this Feather Falls Carex here, which has been really beautiful. I've had mixed success with how fast they grow. This one grows, I got really big, and the one next to it is still really tiny. This area of the garden is more like a place for a vision. Right now, it doesn't look like much. There are some cosmos in here that were trimmed back recently, and some are starting to rebloom. In the center, there are 16, I believe, of these roses by proven winners called Oh So Easy Double Pink. And they have really beautiful pink roses on them, which I'll bring a little sprig up there so you can see. And they grow in these perfect little bouquets that you can just cut the whole bouquet off and add to flower arrangements, which is really, really nice and beautiful. So besides from that, I think this space will have some additions this year, some other things, but there's some yarrow called Peach Sky, which is really beautiful as well. I'll take a sprig of that and show you. So this Peach Sky Yarrow is one of my favorites. It's really beautiful in arrangements. It actually looks really close up, like pink and yellow, but the combination gives it this kind of orangey color as it comes out in bloom. Kind of at the back of this bed is a 9-bark. We have another barberry called Sequins, which I'll show you, has beautiful variegated foliage, kind of rare-ish for a barberry, and it's supposed to have like pink and white and green. Right now it's kind of just green and white. The new growth tends to be a little more pink, and so it's not technically putting on new growth right now. This monster right here is a black hollyhock, which I've not gotten any blooms on this year. It just keeps producing tons of foliage. In front here we have more of the big blue liriope or monkey grass, and then we have a hedge of these tater tot arborvitae, which are some of my kind of favorite little things in the garden right now. I have a ton of them. I planted a bunch of them last year, and they're just the perfect little spheres. They're supposed to grow in perfect spheres, and this is intended to be kind of a boxwood substitute one day. So these will get up and touch and just kind of form a perfectly little round shaped hedge all the way down this garden bed. In here we have a daylily called Nicole's Drama Queen, which is one of my favorites, a beautiful yellow. And then we have a snowbell called Evening Light, which produces these beautiful white blooms that look like little ballerina skirts in the spring. And then it produces tiny berries, which are kind of insignificant, but they're cute, dangling from the branches. This was just planted this spring, so it's really tiny, but the Evening Light snowbell is a tree that you won't find in a lot of people's gardens, but it stays relatively small. It's a great specimen tree, and the intent was just to have some nice upward structure in the space next to my moon gate. This space is the moon gate, and I am really excited to have added this to my garden last year. It was one of the things I was looking forward to. I wanted something that roses could climb on, and so the roses I picked out that were planted this spring are Teasing Georgia. I had to have a southern element, southern named rose in my garden, and Teasing Georgia is a beautiful yellow rose. I just mentioned that I love yellow roses, and it's quickly going to be one of my favorites. These have put on a lot of growth this year. They were small when I got in, but eventually they're going to cover this moon gate and be a very nice thing to walk under in the spring in full bloom. Flanked on the side of this path, which is just stone picked up from a landscape center, are more Serendipity Alliums. They're really beautiful. They just came into bloom right now. They tend to be a little behind the Millennium, it seems like, but these were just planted last year, and so they may just be a little behind because they were getting settled in, still being their first year. But I'm really impressed with the size of them. Those will thicken up and be a nice little hedge of almost chive looking structures, which is really beautiful. And at the back here we have green tower boxwoods, and so these are going to be a perfect little round boxwood that has very upright texture and look really nice here as they grow up a little more. These are Green Mountain, which is a really popular variety, so these are going to be beautiful as well. And right next door is a Limelight Hydrangea, which is going to be beautiful, and I might trim into a tree form so the blooms are more upright and I can underplant it. This area of the garden is a little bit of a mix mash, and so we have a Winecraft Black Smoke Bush, which has been very, very slow to take off in my garden. This is the first year that it's probably tripled in size. It has just sat there for the previous years. You can actually see the blooms still here and the beautiful purple foliage that's comes out, and so it's one of the most beautiful specimens in the garden right here. I have it right next to a totem pole grass that is actually a blue color, and it looks really beautiful. And then there's a yellow summer gold Japanese maple here. And this is a Japanese maple that's supposed to be able to take more sun. It did burn a little bit and crisp up because it's not technically on drip right in this spot when we had a little bit of a droughty few weeks in extreme heat, but it still is doing really well in that area. This is an Invincible Spirit Hydrangea, which has struggled a bit in the sun that it gets in this location. I'm gonna leave it here another year and see how it does. And I really just love the pink blooms on them. This is its first year in the garden, so it's just probably gonna burn being a hydrangea. It is on drip, but it's just, you know, for a few years those hydrangeas are difficult to keep enough water on. And then we just have some various coneflowers here, and some more catmints and irises that I did not get blooms on this year, but this one is supposed to be really beautiful, and it's called Buried Treasure. You can kind of see the tag here. Looks really, really nice, and so I'm excited to get blooms on those next year. This area of the garden is kind of a more cottagey area of this space. We have Millennium Alliums, Eustacia Vi roses, which are really, really magical. These roses are new from David Alston as of this past year, and they are actually some of my favorite pink roses in the garden. You can see how roughly they are. They're really kind of substance, and so they're just really, really nice. It has come back and rebloomed really well for me. We have some Pinkadot phlox back here, which I didn't know how it would do in this part shade location under this willow, but it's actually done really good and rebloomed really well. It's kind of acting as a ground cover. And then back behind here, we have some bloom-struck hydrangeas, which are in their first year. They were small containers when planted, and so we don't have a lot of blooms on those. And they're not doing a whole lot this year, but I'm hoping in future years they'll be really nice. Behind me right here, you may have watched me plant the Snow Queen oak leaf hydrangea, which is really beautiful behind the sunflower, and I think it's going to be great in that space in the coming years. We also have one of my favorite things in my garden coming in the next month or so, even in the next couple weeks. This is a Proudberry coralberry, and I mentioned on my channel lots of times that it's one of my favorite shrubs in the garden. It's super easy to take care of. It produces these beautiful berries in like a few weeks. You can already see the berries on them, but they turn this bright pink, which is something you can't really find in another shrub in the garden. And then in spring, you cut it down to 12 inches and it blooms on new growth, and it's super easy to take care of other than having to be pruned with just hedge shears. That's the only maintenance you have to do, and it has a beautiful habit. It has eucalyptus type leaves that are really beautiful. And so just in the next few weeks, it's going to have these beautiful bright pink berries on there that last forever in arrangements, and also just look really beautiful in the landscape. These hydrangeas are some of my favorite as well. These are Pinky Winky. They have really strong stems. You will never find them drooping. They're more open type bloom, great for pollinators. They get super long. And underneath that, we just have some more of the Red Rover Heucherella, which I've added everywhere to my garden. I did add a blush pink Nandina last year right here, which is going to be nice tucked into this spot, I think. Some more of the Peach Sky Yarrow, which is not blooming great right now. It's coming out a little bit. And then right behind there, we had some Midnight Masquerade Penstemon. And the penstemon behind here, I leave the bloom heads for a little bit, but I'm going to be cutting them off this winter because I found it to be very invasive if you leave it over winter. It's coming up everywhere right here. You can see it coming on the ground right here. And so I would recommend, although the bloom heads are beautiful, to leave in winter and even leave right now. I would not recommend leaving that over winter if you don't want it to become kind of invasive in my experience. It's a really beautiful plant, has a really great textured foliage. I don't tend to get it to rebloom in my garden if it's cut back, but leaving the seed heads, you might regret it. So consider removing those about this time this year before they reseed. So as we come to the end of this garden tour, we're going to talk about the front garden just a little bit. So I said the garden mostly started in 2019, so a lot of the focus would have happened in the front yard, potentially maybe in 2018 as well. There are a lot of hostas to my left here that I purchased from Facebook Marketplace from a woman locally for $3 a start. Those are looking really beautiful, as you can see here. To the right of me, we have a Green Mountain Boxwood cone and some Boxwood Winter Gem. in a slight hedge formation that I've been pruning into balls for the past couple years as they put on some growth. And these beautiful baskets this year that I typically have petunias in every year. I'll put a picture up on the screen of what those have looked like in years past. But for this year, I've really focused on foliage, and I really, really love the way these containers have come out. They're made of mostly coleus. There are some caladiums, some white Christmas caladiums, I believe they're called, and some alternanthera called purple prince. But otherwise, the entirety of these containers are made up of coleus. One's called Chocolate Drop, which is the one that's kind of hanging low and more vining. We have Wicked Witch in the center and just some generic ones from the garden center surrounding all of those. So these spaces have been really beautiful for a few years, but they're needing some work. I'm gonna come in and add some ferns to this area. We do have some mahogany monster heuchera down here, which I really love, along with some creeping Jenny, which I have contained very carefully in this bed. Creeping Jenny is something that's a lovely ground cover, but it's also something that can get out of control really quickly, so you have to be careful where you place it. On this side, we have some more heuchera, and directly behind that is an astilbe called Little Visions in Pink, which I really love the seed heads later this season that they have, but they have this most beautiful pink color in late spring when they come out early summer. Directly behind those, we have some tiny tough stuff hydrangeas, which have sporadically bloomed for me. I think some of them get more sun than others, and they bloom pretty well. And then a couple on the back side here don't get enough light. So this is a very kind of odd lighting situation, and a lot of the stuff has really loved it here. We have a hedge of lavender below me, but the petunias even did really well right here. This is a sweet Bay Magnolia to my left, and so this is going to continue to grow upward and probably provide more shade in the future. This side of our house is eastern facing, so it gets sun in the morning, but a lot of this stuff gets enough full sun that it can perform really well, while also has some interesting areas where I can put some more shade-loving plants. So this area is also contains a lot of foliage. There are a lot of hosta down here at the bottom. This is a hosta that I don't know the specific variety type of, this green one, but they're in desperate need of division. And so this year I'm going to come through and try and divide some of those and move them to the back a little bit under the willow that I have back there that's doing really well and starting to provide some shade. Behind those, we have these little giant arborvitae, which are these perfect spheres that never have to be pruned. I really love them. I try and think of them as a bigger version of tater tot that I was showing you in the back. They just look really nice. They may take on a little snow load damage if you have heavy snows because they're not super sturdy. You can see they kind of move around in the breeze here. But I have really loved them in this location. They're kind of protected from the wind in winter, and they just have performed really well in this part sun location. Behind that, I have a blue chiffon hibiscus on standard. So this area specifically is where I'm going to start focusing on some planting coming up this fall. And so under this blue chiffon, I think I'm going to put some ferns for some nice leafy texture here and to kind of disguise my hose reel and my backflow device for my irrigation. Behind me earlier this year, I placed a new hydrangea by Monrovia called Newport. It's Seaside Serenade Newport, I believe, and it has just really beautiful thick blooms on it. It is a macrophylla, which don't tend to do well in our zone 6. However, it is a reblooming or remontant variety, blooms on both old wood and new wood. So I'm happy that I might have found a spot here that's protected enough in winter, provides it enough sun that it will bloom well, but also, you know, has the lighting conditions that it won't burn. And so I've talked about in a previous video, I'm going to be limbing up this spruce as well. That's going to allow me to underplant some other things in this location that are also shade loving that you can actually see. Right now, the things that I've kind of tucked under it don't do great. So I've got some heuchera over here. They don't tend to get enough light to do really well. So I just want to give everything a chance to thrive really great in this location. So while this part of the garden hasn't been a big focus over the past 2 years, I'm going to start turning my attention more up here and kind of tweaking things here and there, including removing a few things this fall and removing some stuff from the back up here that'll be more happier in that part sun location. And I just think this is going to be a great space by the time I'm done. I do have a rose over here. It's on standard as well. It is a little crazy right now. I will put the name of that variety on there. I'm not sure how I'm feeling about roses on standard. I know they can be really lovely, but this one just seems really leggy, so it may have to be moved somewhere else in the garden as well. So this, I find, is a very specific area that is constantly being tweaked because of the lighting conditions. Some stuff wants more light than I can give it here. Some stuff, it gets too much light. So the hostas are really happy here if they're provided enough irrigation. Last year we had an irrigation issue and they didn't get a lot of water and they were really crispy by this time of year. So this blue chiffon hibiscus standard is really happy, so that tells you it gets pretty good light to allow this thing to bloom pretty well. But it's just something that we have to tweak as we go on from year to year. This area of the garden is also one of my favorite, and it's one of my oldest. We have some Irish moss below this fountain, which I planted several years ago now. This is not moss that grew naturally. It did come from 6-packs from Lowe's and Home Depot. However, it does pretty well in this location. We've had a little bit of die-off this past year that was more severe than others. And I think it's because a lot of the die-off happens on the moss that's covered the actual stone that was here originally. Winter's just a little too tough for it. The stone gets extra cold and keeps it cold longer, and so it just doesn't survive as great. It typically bounces back by the end of the year, but you can see some browning up here in this location. Most of this is just dead that needs to come up that's been directly sitting on top of stone. But otherwise, this location is going to be taking on a few more hydrangeas. The tough stuff ahas that I'm going to be moving from the back, I'm going to kind of tuck under this spruce here. We have a sprinter boxwood for some evergreen interest. That's also something else I want to focus in the front yard, is to tuck some more boxwood around here and there, because there's not a whole lot of winter interest up here other than these beautiful spruces. This is also an area that I want to put some attention on this year, particularly with evergreen interest, because there's not anything in this bed that's evergreen. So I'm going to be tucking some boxwoods that I have here and there. I have the beautiful hidecoat or hidecoat lavender hedge that's been here. It's one of the first big things that I added to the front garden. So this is probably its at least third, probably fourth year. And then we have some Millennium Alliums, which are beautiful. They've been growing a few years in this space. Wee white hydrangea up front, some dwarf liriope or variegated liriope. Behind there are some phlox that I've just left the seed heads on because I think it's really pretty despite needing to be cut back. I kind of leave this and don't shear this variety back. It may rebloom if I was to trim it back, but I haven't in years past just because I think it's an interesting texture. We have some drops of Jupiter oregano back here that's really beautiful and a striking yellow color with purple blooms. And then we have this snow sickle hydrangea that I planted earlier this year. Just probably about a month ago I got in and got planted, and it's doing really good. It's put on quite a bit of growth, and I'm really excited for how that's going to fill this space, because I really needed something right here in front of this blue spruce to kind of provide some texture and also some bloom. Otherwise, there was a Crimson Queen Japanese maple in here. We have some just generic white floristan, or gay feather it's also called. And I tucked a butterfly bush in here, a dwarf weigela that's got some black foliage, and some of those perennials that you saw in the perennial Southside perennial bed earlier, including some of that perfect profusion salvia and some of those Ameria and some other items. This container in particular is looking pretty interesting this year. It's full of a combination of things that I grew from seed and also purchased. And so I limited my annual purchases this year to probably less than 10 actual annual purchases. And that included this salvia here, which is a purple salvia from Proven Winners. this yellow canna, which is actually just starting to enter rebloom here. I did come through and trim off some of those seed heads the other day, and I think this one's called Toucan Yellow. We have some more of that Globe Amaranth. This is QIS, I think it's called, Quality and Seed Dwarf or Globe Amaranth. And then underneath we have some Kent's Beauty Oregano, which is a beautiful spiller for your containers if you've never utilized it before. And that's pretty much all there is in this container. It is kind of covering up an obelisk in here that I purchased earlier this year that just as some height before the toucan cannas took over. And I've just been really impressed with how this container has done. I haven't focused, since I don't do a lot of annual planting, on a lot of containers in years past. That's something I need to work on in future years. But this kind of combination come together really well, and the hummingbirds love the salvia. And this side of the garden is relatively simple. We have a Bobo Hydrangea down here. There's a yellow one behind here called Lemon Daddy, and it's been in the garden a few years, but it dies down to the ground every year because it's a macrophylla, and I've considered moving it to the back under the willow. It never blooms. I've also considered completely removing it. It is a nice lemony foliage texture though, so I've kept it. As I transition the space, that would probably be a really good spot for some evergreen boxwood interest, and so that may get removed as a result of that. But we may find somewhere else in the garden, just because it, even though it doesn't bloom, and it probably would never bloom here, it is a very nice foliage texture. Behind there we have a Desdemona Rose, which is also a beautiful rose. It needs some deadheading right now. It's starting to rebloom a little bit, but it has a really beautiful smell to it as well. It's one of my favorites. Below here we have a Helen von Stein lamb's ear. So this lamb's ear gets a little bigger, the actual leaves do, than typical lamb's ear, and it just provides a nice foliage texture. Now lamb's ear can kind of be aggressive in its spreading habits, so I come every spring and clean it up quite a bit around the edges just to keep it contained. It dies back completely in winter. I've never had this variety bloom for me, which those bloom stalks on these can kind of ratty looking, and so I would remove those if I ever did get a bloom, but I'm not sure that Helen von Stein blooms anyway, so it may just be a non-blooming variety. Regular lamb's ear does tend to set off bloom heads, but I just really love it. It's not for everybody. It does readily propagate, like move around really easily, so if you wanted to move it from one part of your garden to the other, it's also super hardy and bulks up really quickly. So it's a great perennial for this texture, this soft kind of bluish green gray color in the garden. I have it tucked against a rock here, and here's some beautiful coneflowers that I can't remember the name of, but they are really lovely. This area of the garden out front has been one that's kind of taken stages as the years have progressed. It was originally a much smaller bed, and I expanded it probably 2 years ago now to kind of make it symmetrical along the lines here. And it's full of all sorts of hosta and shade-loving plants, because this tree casts a lot of shade, but it does get a good amount of morning sunlight. And so beside me here, you'll find more of those bloom-struck hydrangeas. These are macrophyllas that bloom on both old wood and new wood, so I am able to get blooms on these, even though it didn't return great this year. These were salvage plants from Home Depot, and so last year was really their year that they needed to grow in and get settled in. I didn't get blooms on, looks like about 2 of the plants. 2 of them did bloom, and so I still consider these recovering because they were in such bad health when I picked them up that they're still in recovery stage, for my opinion. In front of those we have Invincible Ruby, which I really love. Invincible Ruby, I have a slight hedge here. They have done really well, and if you've not considered Invincible Ruby, certainly give it a chance. They have beautiful mauve red blooms that come out in the spring, and they transition to this dusty color here. In front of them we have a hedge of Sprinter Boxwood, which I intend to eventually create just a formal hedge in front of these hydrangea. These beautiful yellow specimen that you see here, there's 3 of them in kind of a grouping, is something that everyone I think should have in their garden. This is Sun King Aurelia, and it's almost like a shrub. Now in this location, they've been here for probably at least 2 years. I think this is probably more likely their 3rd year. in the ground. They're not getting as big as they might in landscapes where they get a little more sun, but they're still such a beautiful structure. So these die completely down to the ground in spring and come up in almost this shrub form. It is a very nice pop of color for a shade garden. You should definitely consider adding these. And on this side, you may have seen these dotted throughout. This is Blueberry Muffin Ajuga, which I'm trying to cover this area a little bit so I don't have to mulch as consistently. It should grow up and cover this tubing here in the future. I have a hard time getting mulch to stay there because it is on a little bit of an incline, so it wants to run off or blow off during winter. Behind there is one of my pride and joys in the garden, and this is Empress Wu Hosta. And so there's two of them here. This is a clump and that's a clump. But these are just beautiful. They have this wonderful textured foliage. If you have spring hailstorms, it can be kind of harsh on them because they do have such big leaves. This one's a little protected, but I'm really loving it. The more water they get, the more happy they are. And this is kind of a low spot in our landscape where water drains, and they've been very happy in this location. This area right here is also new as of the past year, and this area will also probably be taking on some changes in the coming year because, and even this fall, because I'm going to be moving some of these shrubs. So these are Proudberry coral berries that I have between these kindred spirit oaks. So these kindred spirit oaks are beautiful. They get 4 to 6 foot wide and pretty tall, so there'll be a nice structure here even in winter because they are very upright. So they're not evergreen, but they will be a nice structure. Below those we have a hedge of sprinter boxwoods, and so I want these to be a kind of a formal area. And inside the bed, they don't look great this year because they were just planted in the spring, but are a mix of heuchera, and so you might be able to see them. There is Black Pearl, there's one called Lemon Supreme, Forever Red, Forever Purple, and that's, I think, the only varieties in this bed. We do have a different shrub here called Arctic Sun Dogwood, which is this yellow stemmed dogwood there. Also nothing substantive as to blooms, but it makes really good cutting material for winter arrangements because the bark is actually yellow or kind of orangey. So that one actually may be Arctic Fire, and so it may be orangey. I can't remember the specific variety. I will have to go back and look, but I will put it on the screen. On the end here we have a hydrangea called Limelight Prime, and so Limelight Prime is an improvement on Limelight. The stems are supposed to be stronger and it's supposed to have a smaller habit. A lot of people are looking for hydrangeas to add to their garden these days that are more reasonably sized, and Limelight Prime is going to be a great one, I think. This one's only a couple years old. I grew it the first year in a container to grow it on the patio. It did not love all the heat my patio previously provided without the pergola on it. But I got it in the ground last fall. Really big hole because the roots had spread quite a bit, and they're doing really well, even though they're not on drip irrigation this year. There is a sprinkler head kind of right here, so it probably gets a little overspray from the sprinkler heads, but they've done really well. So I have a few things coming in a month that I'll share in a separate video, and I'm not sure what size those are going to be when they arrive, and so I don't know where exactly I'm going to place them yet. I imagine they'll probably be smaller plants, but I'm excited about them. I'm excited to share them with you, and some of them are probably going to go in this location in the place of the Proudberry coral berries. I'm going to be moving those, since I already have a beautiful specimen over here that I showed you earlier, to different areas of the garden, giving them away to friends or putting them back in a space behind the fence that I intend probably next year to dedicate to cut flowers. And so those will be a great location to put them as like a hedge that I can cut on and not feel bad about cutting on the plants in my garden. I don't know about you, but I really struggle cutting off blooms from the things in the garden because I just think they look so nice. And so I tend to not want to do that. And I just have all these beautiful things that could be cut on and used in cut flower arrangements, but my heart won't let me do it a lot of times. And so I'm going to be moving some of that stuff to a different location that's not directly in eyesight that I can cut on and won't feel bad about it and use them to make some beautiful arrangements throughout the season. So if you're new to my channel and this is the first time you're seeing my garden, welcome. Thanks for joining. This has been very much a passion project for me. Most of what I learned from YouTube myself, And so it's been a pleasure sharing that journey with you and watching people ask questions and answering questions and learning myself. And so thank you to those of you who contribute to the comment section below. Your input's always valuable and always helps someone. Just remember that. Thank you guys for joining me for this year's big summer garden tour. I hope you enjoyed it. Stick around, like and subscribe, and share with your family and friends. And remember, in a world full of hate, be a light. Take care, everyone. Bye.